The rain hit the windshield like static as Amalia Voss's car rolled through the iron gates of her own estate. She hadn't planned to come home tonight. The Chicago Logistics Summit wasn't supposed to end until tomorrow, but a cancelled panel and a gut feeling she couldn't explain had put her on the earliest flight back. She should have trusted that feeling sooner. The house was too quiet. No staff at the door. No lights in the East Wing where Cassian usually worked past midnight, reviewing shipping manifests that were never quite as clean as they looked. Amalia climbed the marble staircase 2 steps at a time, her heels echoing off walls that had watched her grow up in this family, in this business, in this impossible marriage. The study door was open. Bryn was standing behind Cassian's desk, like she belonged there. Not sitting, standing, arms crossed, chin lifted, wearing the kind of smile Amalia hadn't seen since they were 22, and splitting a bottle of wine on a dorm room floor, promising each other they'd always have each other's backs. Cassian stood near the window, his back to the room, shoulders rigid, saying nothing. "Amalia." Bryn said her name like she'd been waiting all night to say it. "You're early. What is this?" Bryn slid a folder across the desk instead of answering. Amalia didn't move to take it, so Bryn opened it herself, turning each page like a dealer, laying down a winning hand. Corporate transfer documents, property deeds, signature lines already filled. Cassian's handwriting, unmistakable, the same signature she'd watched him use to close 9-figure deals. "He signed everything over," Bryn said. "The company, the estate, all of it, to protect us, to protect him from what's coming. He finally understands what he needs. A partner who actually fits his world. Amalia, not someone who was just convenient for the family ledger." Amalia's eyes went to Cassian's back, her husband. 3 years of marriage, arranged on paper, real in every way that mattered to her. The quiet mornings, the way he used to trace circles on her wrist when he thought she was asleep. The nights he'd come home from something dark and dangerous and let her be the only soft place in his life. "Cassian." Her voice cracked on his name. "Say something." He didn't turn around. His jaw was tight. His hands braced against the window frame, like it was the only thing keeping him upright. And that silence, that awful, unbearable silence, told her everything Bryn's smug little folder couldn't. He wasn't denying it. Amalia had spent her whole life being underestimated. The curvy girl who didn't fit the mold of the polished, brittle women who usually married into syndicate money. The one people whispered about at galas, wondering how she'd landed a man like Cassian Marchetti. She'd spent 3 years proving them wrong with quiet competence, holding half his empire together from behind the scenes while he handled the parts of the business that couldn't survive in daylight. And now the 2 people she trusted most in the world were standing in her husband's study at midnight, and neither of them could look her in the eye. Something inside her went very still, not numb, sharper than that. A cold, clear kind of pain that made every next decision feel simple. She picked up the pen. "Amalia, wait." Bryn's voice hitched, the first real crack in her composure, like she hadn't expected this part to go so easily. "You wanted this," Amalia said quietly, signing her name to the release forms without reading a single line. "Congratulations. You have it." She set the pen down, walked past both of them without another word, and went upstairs. She didn't pack much. A single bag, the essentials, the small wooden box of her mother's jewelry that no signature on earth could take from her. She left her wedding ring on the nightstand, facing the door, so it would be the first thing Cassian saw when he finally worked up the courage to look at anything. The rain hadn't let up when she stepped outside. She didn't call a driver. She walked down the long gravel drive in the dark, soaked through by the time she reached the gate, and didn't look back once at the house that had been her whole life. Behind her, In the warm light of the study, Bryn allowed herself a slow, satisfied breath. The breath of a woman who believes she's finally won. She turned to Cassian, expecting relief, expecting gratitude, expecting something from him now that the hard part was over. Instead, Cassian was still staring out the window at the empty driveway, at the gate swinging shut behind his wife, with an expression Bryn didn't recognize on his face at all. It wasn't triumph. It looked, unmistakably, like a man who had just made the worst mistake of his life, and didn't understand why he couldn't remember signing anything at all. The boardroom on the 40th floor had views of the entire city, but nobody in the room was looking at the skyline. Every eye was on the head of the table, where Cassian Marchetti sat beside Bryn, waiting for the final transfer documents to be notarized and filed. 3 days. That's all it had taken for Bryn to move the board meeting up, to rush the paperwork, to install herself in the chair that used to belong to Amalia's late father. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that morning, sharp, expensive, borrowed confidence stitched into every seam. Cassian sat beside her, looking like a man walking through fog, still not quite steady on his feet, still not quite sure why his own hands felt like they belonged to someone else these past few weeks. The company's general counsel cleared his throat. Before we proceed, there's a matter that needs addressing. The doors at the far end of the room opened. Amalia walked in first, dry now, dressed not in the soft cashmere Bryn remembered her wearing at home, but in a sharp navy suit that looked like armor. Behind her came 2 attorneys Bryn had never seen before. Not the family's usual counsel, but outside litigators, the kind firms hired when they expected war. Bryn's smile faltered for the first time in 3 days. "Amalia, this doesn't concern you anymore. You signed." "I signed my release," Amalia said, taking the seat directly across from her, calm in a way that unsettled the entire room. "I never signed anything giving away the estate or the company, because I couldn't. Not without breaking a trust neither of you bothered to read." She nodded to her attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Reyes, who opened a leather folder and slid a single document to the center of the table. "The Sterling Family Trust," Reyes said, "established by Amalia's grandfather, governs both the mansion and controlling interest in this company. Under the trust deed, ownership can only transfer through an uncoerced, direct bloodline signature. Mr. Marchetti's signature, however it was obtained, has no legal standing over trust assets. It never did." Cassian's head came up slowly, like the words were taking too long to reach him. "That's not possible. I reviewed those contracts myself, months ago, before—" "Before what?" Amalia asked softly. It wasn't an accusation. It sounded almost like concern, buried under 3 days of heartbreak she refused to show in this room. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The truth was, he didn't remember reviewing anything clearly at all. Just fragments. A haze of late nights and cups of tea Bryn always brought him personally, insisting he needed to stay sharp, stay careful, watch his back. He remembered feeling afraid of things that made no sense in daylight. Federal agents, betrayal. Amalia's name whispered somewhere it shouldn't have been. Bryn's hand found his under the table, a small, tightening pressure. "Don't let her rattle you," she murmured. "This is a stall tactic." "It's not a stall tactic," Reyes said, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "It's the law, and there's a second matter." Amalia finally leaned forward. This was the part she'd waited 3 days to say. "The trust also contains a protective clause," she said. "If anyone connected to this family attempts an unauthorized transfer of trust assets, using coercion, forgery, or any illegitimate signature, it triggers an automatic freeze. Every syndicate credit line routed through Sterling Logistics, every shell account, every laundering channel disguised as a shipping contract, Every dollar Cassian's organization has moved through my family's company for the last 3 years. The room went silent enough to hear the city traffic 40 floors below. You're bluffing, Bryn said, but her voice had lost its polish. Check your accounts, Amalia said simply. It already happened. 10 minutes ago. Cassian's phone buzzed, then buzzed again, then didn't stop. He pulled it from his jacket with hands that weren't quite steady and watched notification after notification stack up. Frozen transfers, declined authorizations, panicked messages from lieutenants who ran the parts of his empire that never appeared on paper. For the first time in 3 days, something like clarity cut through the fog in his mind. He looked at Amalia, really looked at her, the way he hadn't let himself since the night she walked out into the rain, and saw not an enemy, but a woman who had been 3 steps ahead of everyone in this room the entire time. Amalia, you had every chance to say something in that study, she said, standing, gathering nothing because she'd brought nothing to gather. You didn't. So now you get to sit in this room and watch what happens when you sign away things that were never yours to sign. She walked out the way she'd walked in, steady, dry-eyed, unstoppable, leaving her attorneys to handle the paperwork and leaving Bryn staring at a boardroom full of executives who were already quietly recalculating who actually held the power in this company. Cassian sat frozen in his chair long after the doors closed, his phone still buzzing in his hand, one thought cutting through the wreckage of the last 3 days louder than anything else. Why can't I remember signing those forms clearly at all? The villa belonged to no one Cassian knew. That was the point. Amalia had bought it years ago, under a shell name, a quiet insurance policy tucked into a hillside above the sea, the kind of place a woman builds when she grows up learning that even family can turn into strangers overnight. She hadn't told anyone about it, not her attorneys, not her assistant, not even Bryn, who had known nearly every other secret in her life. For 2 weeks, she let herself disappear here. No calls from the board, no lawyers, just salt air through open windows and the slow, aching work of remembering how to breathe without a husband's name attached to every thought. The package arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by hand from Marcus Webb, the private investigator her family had used for 3 generations. Discreet, thorough, loyal only to the Sterling bloodline. Amalia signed for it on the terrace, sat down with a cup of tea she didn't drink, and opened it alone. Inside was a manila folder, thick and unmarked, and beneath it, wrapped in plain brown paper, a leather journal she recognized instantly. Cassian's handwriting. She didn't know how Webb had gotten it, didn't want to know, not yet. But her hands were already shaking before she opened the first page. The folder held toxicology reports first. Amalia read them twice to make sure she wasn't imagining the words. Trace compounds consistent with mild sedative hallucinogen compounds, likely administered orally over an extended period. A private lab Webb had used to test a sample from Cassian's private tea set, the porcelain one that never left his study, the one only one other person ever touched. Bryn. Amalia's stomach turned over slowly, like the ground shifting under a house she'd thought was built on solid rock. She opened the journal next, and the truth unspooled page by page, in Cassian's own increasingly frantic handwriting. She keeps saying I need to stay sharp. She brings the tea herself now, says the staff can't be trusted since the audit rumors started. I don't remember agreeing to that, but I must have. Everything feels slower lately, heavier. Further in, dated only a week before the night in the study, Bryn showed me photographs. Amalia at a private airfield, meeting men in suits, federal insignia on one man's jacket. I told her it wasn't possible. Amalia would never. But Bryn said she'd been protecting me from the truth for months because she didn't want to break my heart. I don't want to believe it. God help me. Some nights I do. Amalia's throat tightened. She had never been to that airfield, had never met with any federal agent in her life. Whatever photographs Cassian had seen were fabricated, and fabricated well enough to poison a man's trust in his own wife, while his mind was too clouded by sedatives to question it properly. The last entries were the ones that broke her. If Amalia really is talking to the feds, signing everything to her, keeping her name clean, might be the only way to protect her when this all comes down. Let them think I did it alone. Let them think I'm the only one who's dirty. She never deserved any of this. Not the marriage her father arranged, not the danger I brought into her life, not a husband who can't even trust his own head anymore. I love her too much to let her go down with me. Amalia sat very still on the terrace, the sea wind pulling at the pages in her lap, and let the full shape of it settle over her. It hadn't been betrayal at all. Or rather, it had been betrayal, but not the kind she'd assumed that awful night in the rain. Bryn hadn't just seen an opportunity and taken it. She had built the opportunity brick by brick over months, drugging Cassian slowly enough that he'd blame his own paranoia, feeding him a fake threat about the one person who actually loved him, engineering a fictional federal raid to make his sacrifice feel noble instead of manufactured. And Cassian, reckless, foolish, terrified Cassian, had signed away his entire world, not out of greed or indifference, but because some twisted, drug-addled version of loyalty told him it was the only way to save her. It didn't excuse his silence in that study. It didn't erase the 2 weeks of grief she'd carried alone in this house. But it changed the shape of the wound completely, from "he never loved me" into something far more complicated, and in some ways, far more painful. Amalia closed the journal and pressed it against her chest, staring out at the dark water until the sun dropped fully behind the horizon. Somewhere back in the city, Bryn believed she'd already won. Believed the trust deed was just a temporary inconvenience, a legal hiccup to route around with enough money and enough patience. She had no idea Amalia now held proof of exactly what she'd done. Toxicology reports, fabricated evidence, months of quiet poisoning dressed up as friendship. Amalia picked up her phone for the first time in 2 weeks and called Marcus Webb back. "I need everything you have on Bryn Callahan's financials," she said, her voice steady even as her hands still trembled around the journal. "Every account, every shell company, every rival she's been talking to." Because if Bryn thought this war was over, she was about to learn exactly how wrong she was. The club sat beneath a defunct jazz bar on the east side, the kind of place that only existed on paper as a private members' lounge. In reality, it was where what remained of Cassian's syndicate met when things needed to be said, away from cameras and courtrooms. And things needed to be said, badly. 3 weeks after the boardroom freeze, the empire Cassian had spent a decade building was coming apart at the seams. Every account routed through Sterling Logistics remained locked. Legitimate shipping contracts had dried up overnight once word got out that the company's ownership was in legal dispute. Underground buyers who once trusted Cassian's word now trusted nothing, because a man who can't move his own money can't be trusted to move theirs. Bryn sat at the head of the private table where Cassian used to sit, flanked by 2 lieutenants who hadn't yet realized their loyalty had been misplaced. She'd spent the last 2 weeks trying to hold the crumbling pieces together. With threats and promises, she had no real power to keep. "We move the northern trade routes," she said, sliding a folder across to a man Cassian's people had only ever spoken of, in careful whispers. Vane. A rival syndicate boss from across the river, patient and precise. The kind of man who collected other people's mistakes like currency. Full access to the shipping lanes, the port contacts, everything Sterling controls on paper. In exchange, you clear our outstanding debts and give us cover until the freeze lifts. Vane studied her with mild, unreadable interest. You don't own those routes. I will, Bryn said. Give it time. Time, Vane repeated slowly, is the one thing your little syndicate doesn't have anymore. Miss Callahan. He signed nothing that night. Men like Vone didn't make deals with desperation. They waited for it to collapse further and then bought the wreckage for pennies. Bryn left the meeting with promises instead of guarantees, which was, she was beginning to realize with quiet panic, all she'd had from the very beginning. Across the city, in a private recovery suite Amalia's attorneys had arranged without either of them knowing the other had a hand in it, Cassian was finally waking up. Not literally, he'd never been unconscious, not exactly, but the fog that had wrapped around his mind for months was lifting in strange, disorienting waves, like surfacing from deep water too fast. The physician Marcus Webb quietly arranged confirmed what the toxicology reports already suggested. Months of low-dose sedative compounds, administered consistently enough to dull his judgment without ever tipping into obvious impairment. Enough to make him doubt himself. Enough to make him believe a woman he loved could betray him, and a woman who'd been betraying him all along could be trusted completely. Cassian sat by the window of the recovery suite, a folder of Webb's findings in his lap. Quietly delivered, no note attached, no explanation needed. He didn't need one. Every entry matched the last months of his own increasingly frantic journal, which meant only one person could have gotten this information into his hands. Amalia. Even now, even after everything, she was the one making sure he understood the truth. He found Bryn 2 nights later, back at the underground club, going over ledgers with the same 2 lieutenants, trying to calculate how many more months the syndicate could survive on fumes and empty promises. She looked up when he walked in, and, for just a moment, her practiced composure cracked into something almost relieved. Cassian, you're up and moving. Good. Vane's people need reassurance that you're still... Stop. His voice was quiet, but it landed like a blade through the room. The 2 lieutenants went very still. I want to know what was in the tea. Bryn's face didn't change fast enough. What tea? You brought it to me every night for months. You insisted the staff couldn't be trusted. You told me Amalia was meeting federal agents, showed me photographs that never should have existed, and somewhere in the middle of all that, my mind stopped working the way it used to. He stepped closer, and for the first time in weeks, his hands weren't shaking. I have the toxicology report, Bryn. I have my own journal, page by page, showing exactly how you built this. All of it. The room's temperature seemed to drop. You don't understand, Bryn said, and for a moment, the mask slipped entirely, revealing something raw and calculating underneath. I did this for us. You were always going to choose her eventually, no matter what I did, unless I made sure you couldn't trust her anymore. I loved you before she ever... Get out! Cassian's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You're done here. Whatever authority you think you have over this organization ends right now. You can't just, I can and I am. He turned to the 2 lieutenants, men who'd followed him for years, before 3 weeks of chaos made them forget who actually built this empire. She has no standing in this room anymore. If either of you follow her out that door, don't bother coming back. Bryn stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the man she'd drugged and manipulated into believing his own wife was a traitor, watching him see her clearly for the first time in months. Whatever affection she'd convinced herself was love curdled instantly into something colder. She left without another word, but the look she gave him on her way out promised this wasn't over. Not by a long way. Outside, in the cold night air, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number she'd hoped she wouldn't need yet. Vane, she said when he picked up. I have something better than trade routes to offer you now. I know exactly where to find Amalia Voss. Amalia had come back to the city quietly, the way she did most things now. No announcement, No fanfare. Just a car pulling into the private terminal at dawn to oversee the release of a shipment her legal team had finally unfrozen. It was the first real movement Sterling Logistics had made in a month, and she'd wanted to be there in person to watch it happen. She should have listened to the small, cautious voice, telling her not to come alone. The terminal was mostly empty at that hour. A skeleton crew, a few dock workers checking manifests, the gray morning light barely cutting through fog rolling off the water. Amalia walked the length of container row 14, with her assistant a few steps behind, going over shipping numbers on a tablet, when 3 unmarked vans pulled up at the terminal's service entrance. By the time she registered that something was wrong, it was already too late to run. They moved fast and quiet, the way men do when they've done this before. Her assistant was shoved aside, phone knocked from her hand before she could dial anyone. Amalia fought, clawed at one man's face, drove her heel into another's foot, hard enough to hear him swear. But there were 4 of them, and one of her, and within 90 seconds, she was zip-tied and bundled into the back of a van, the terminal gates sliding shut behind them, like nothing had happened at all. Her assistant, bruised but conscious, did the only thing she could. She triggered the emergency alert on Amalia's phone before the men could grab it fully. A security feature Amalia's father had insisted on years ago, and Amalia had always considered excessive. It wasn't excessive today. News reached Cassian at the safe house. Webb had arranged for his recovery, a modest apartment 2 neighborhoods away from anything connected to his old empire. He was reviewing the last of his own journal entries, trying to piece together the full timeline of Bryn's manipulation, when Webb himself called. Not Amalia's attorneys, not the police, but the one man who'd been quietly tracking every thread of this mess since the night in the study. "She's gone," Webb said. No preamble. Taken from the port terminal 20 minutes ago, her assistant triggered the tracker before they could stop her. "I have a location, but it's moving toward the old shipyard district." "Cassian, this has Vane's fingerprints all over it." The floor seemed to tilt under Cassian's feet. "Bryn," he said, the name tasting like poison. She told him where to find her. "Looks that way." Cassian didn't hesitate, not for a single second, though every rational part of his mind screamed that he had nothing left to fight with. No syndicate muscle. His own men had scattered or defected in the 3 weeks since Bryn's ouster. No weapons. He'd surrendered his personal arsenal voluntarily when Amalia's legal team demanded full compliance as a condition of unfreezing the accounts. A decision he'd made without a second thought, because some part of him had already known he owed her that much good faith. He had nothing, and it didn't matter. "Send me the location," he said, already pulling on his jacket. "I'm going, Cassian, without backup, without, I don't care." His voice cracked slightly, the first real emotion he'd let through since waking from the fog weeks ago. "I already let her walk into that rain alone once, because I was too much of a coward to speak. I am not doing that again." Webb was quiet for a moment, then rattled off an address, an abandoned shipyard on the industrial edge of the harbor, the kind of place that existed for exactly this purpose, out of sight, out of range of any camera or patrol. Cassian drove there alone, hands steady on the wheel despite everything screaming inside him, replaying every version of the last month that had led to this single unbearable moment. The drugged tea, the forged photographs, the boardroom, the freeze, the syndicate's slow collapse, Bryn's face when he'd thrown her out of the club 2 nights ago. All of it had been leading here, to a version of himself, standing at the edge of losing everything that actually mattered. He thought of the mansion, empty without her laughter. Thought of the wedding ring she'd left facing the door, deliberate and precise, a message he'd been too broken to understand until it was almost too late. Thought of her walking into that study 3 weeks ago with the composure of a woman who had already decided to survive whatever came next, alone if she had to. He would not let her face this alone too. The shipyard came into view through the fog. Rusted cranes, stacked containers, a single warehouse with light bleeding out from beneath a half-open door. Cassian parked 2 blocks away, out of sight, and approached on foot through the dark, unarmed, outnumbered, and utterly certain of exactly one thing. Whatever it cost him, his freedom, his pride, the last scraps of the empire he used to command, he was going to walk into that warehouse and give Vane's men every reason to point their guns at him instead of her. He'd failed Amalia once already, in silence, in a study, on a night neither of them could take back. He wasn't going to fail her again. The warehouse smelled like rust and seawater, and old diesel. Amalia sat bound to a metal chair in the middle of the floor, wrists raw from the zip ties, watching 4 of Vane's men move through the shadows, with the bored efficiency of people who did this kind of work, often enough to find it routine. Vane himself stood near a stack of shipping crates, arms folded, waiting for something, or someone. She understood who, the moment the warehouse door creaked open and Cassian stepped through it alone. Her stomach dropped. Of every possible ending to this night, she hadn't let herself imagine this one. Cassian walking in unarmed, hands raised slightly at his sides. None of his old syndicate presence around him. Just a man who looked like he hadn't slept properly in weeks. Cassian, no. The words tore out of her before she could stop them. "Quiet down," one of the guards said, stepping toward her, and Cassian's voice cut across the room before the man could get any closer. "Don't touch her." It wasn't a threat, born of power. He had none left to back it up. It was something closer to a plea, dressed up as a command, and everyone in the room could hear the difference. Vane pushed off the crates and walked forward, unhurried, studying Cassian like he was reading a ledger that had finally balanced in his favor. "You came alone, no muscle, no weapons. That's either very brave or very stupid, Marchetti." "Probably both," Cassian said. "Let her go. Take whatever you want from me instead. Territory, contacts, whatever's left of my name in this city, it's yours. Just let her walk out of here." "There's nothing left of your name," Vane said, almost gently, like he pitied him. "Your accounts are frozen, your men scattered. The only thing you have of any value left is standing right in front of me, tied to a chair, and Bryn Callahan already sold me the location for free." Amalia's eyes cut sharply toward Cassian. Even now, hearing Bryn's name attached to this, betrayal landed like a fresh wound. "Then take me instead of her," Cassian said. "I mean it. I'll sign anything. I'll disappear. Just enough." Vane's patience thinned. He nodded once, and one of his men raised a gun, not toward Cassian, but toward Amalia. A message, not a killing shot, meant to remind Cassian exactly who held the leverage in this room. Cassian moved, before his mind fully caught up with his body. He stepped directly into the line of fire, putting himself between the gun and the chair, and the shot that followed caught him high in the shoulder, spinning him half around before he crashed against the concrete floor. "Cassian!" Amalia's scream tore through the warehouse, raw and desperate, straining hard enough against the zip ties that plastic bit into her skin. For a moment, everything in the room seemed to freeze. Vane's men uncertain whether to finish what they'd started. Vane himself staring down at Cassian with something unreadable flickering behind his composure, like even he hadn't expected a man with nothing left to lose to actually mean it. Cassian pushed himself up onto one elbow, blood soaking fast through his shirt, and looked at Amalia with a clarity that hadn't been in his eyes for months. "I'm sorry," he said, quiet enough that only she could really hear it over the ringing in her ears. "For all of it. I should have said something in that study. I should have trusted you from the start. Don't you dare die apologizing to me, she said, tears cutting tracks down her face, fighting against restraints that wouldn't give. That was the moment the warehouse doors blew open on the far side. Floodlights cut through the fog first, followed by a dozen figures in tactical gear moving in fast, coordinated formation. Amalia's private security detail, the same automatic tracking system her assistant had triggered at the terminal, finally converging on the signal after tracing it through 3 false stops Vane's men had built to throw off pursuit. They hit the warehouse from 2 directions at once, and within seconds, Vane's men were disarmed, cuffed, or flat on the ground, shouting protests that meant nothing to trained professionals who'd been briefed to expect exactly this outcome. Vane himself didn't resist. He simply raised his hands, expression flat, already calculating his exit strategy from whatever legal mess this became. Amalia's team cut her free the moment the room was secure, and she was on her knees beside Cassian before anyone could stop her, pressing both hands hard against the wound in his shoulder, blood slick and warm under her fingers. "Stay with me," she said, voice breaking. "Stay with me. Don't you dare." "I'm not going anywhere," he managed, a weak, pained attempt at something like a smile. "Told you, not leaving you to face this alone again." The paramedics her security chief had already called reached them minutes later, and as they loaded Cassian onto a stretcher, Amalia walked beside him the entire way to the ambulance, refusing to let go of his hand even once, even when the doors closed between them, and the last thing she saw was his eyes, still fixed on hers, still holding on. The surgery had gone well, the doctors said. The bullet had missed anything vital by less than an inch, a fact the surgeon repeated twice, like he still couldn't quite believe it himself. Cassian spent the first day in and out of sedation, guarded around the clock by 2 of Amalia's private security officers stationed outside his door. Not because anyone thought Vane's people would try again, but because Amalia had insisted, and after everything, nobody argued with her insistence anymore. She hadn't left the hospital in 3 days. She slept in the chair by his window in short, uneasy stretches, waking each time a monitor beeped differently than it had a moment before. On the morning of the 3rd day, her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus Webb. 2 words, no elaboration needed. "She's caught." Federal marshals had picked up Bryn Callahan at the airport, attempting to board a private charter under a name that wasn't hers, carrying a laptop full of offshore account numbers and enough documentation of laundered syndicate funds to keep prosecutors busy for years. It turned out Vane's arrest at the shipyard had come with consequences neither woman had planned for. Under pressure, facing decades in federal prison himself, Vane had wasted no time handing over everything he had on Bryn in exchange for a lighter sentence. The trade routes she'd tried to sell him, the tip about Amalia's location, all of it, laid out neatly for prosecutors, like a confession she never had to make herself. Amalia read the message twice, then set the phone face down on the windowsill and looked over at Cassian, who was awake now, watching her with the quiet attentiveness of a man who'd had 3 days to think about very little else besides everything he'd done wrong. "They got her," Amalia said. Something in his face shifted. Not relief exactly, more like the last piece of a long, painful puzzle finally settling into place. "Good," he said quietly. "She deserves whatever's coming." They sat with that for a while, the hospital room quiet, except for the soft rhythm of the monitors. Amalia hadn't asked him the hard questions yet. Not in the chaos of the shipyard, not in the ambulance, not through 3 days of watching him drift in and out of sedation. But she needed to ask them now, before either of them could pretend the last month hadn't happened. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked. "That night in the study, you just stood there." Cassian was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the ceiling like the answer might be easier to find there then looking at her directly. "Because I believed you'd betrayed me," he said finally. "God help me, Amalia. I actually believed it. She'd built it so carefully. The photographs, the whispers about federal agents, months of drugging me slowly enough that I couldn't tell my judgment was gone until it was already too late. By the time you walked into that study, I thought signing everything away was the only way to protect you from what I believed was coming. I thought I was being noble. I was being a coward who couldn't even manage to tell his own wife the truth to her face. You could have asked me," Amalia said, her voice tight. "You could have just asked." "I know." He turned to look at her then, and the guilt in his expression was unmistakable. Raw in a way 3 years of careful marriage had never let her see before. "I let a stranger's manipulation matter more than 3 years of knowing exactly who you are. My stoicism, my paranoia, it nearly cost me the only good thing I've ever had in my life. And I don't expect you to forgive that easily. I don't think you should." He reached toward the nightstand, wincing at the pull in his shoulder, and picked up a folded set of papers he'd apparently had one of the nurses print for him the day before, when Amalia had stepped out briefly to speak with her attorneys. "I had these drawn up," he said, holding them out to her. "Unconditional divorce papers, full release of any claim I might have to anything. The estate, the company, none of it was ever really mine to claim anyway. You don't have to sign anything to be free of me, Amalia. I'll sign whatever gives you peace. I just want you to have your life back, without my mess attached to it anymore." Amalia stared at the papers in his outstretched hand for a long moment, her expression unreadable, the weight of the last month sitting heavy behind her eyes. She didn't take them. "I'll think about it," she said quietly, which was more honesty than either of them expected from her in that moment. She stood, smoothing down her jacket, needing air and distance more than she needed to sit through the rest of this conversation right now. "Get some rest, Cassian. You still look like death." She left the papers on the nightstand where he'd set them and walked out of the hospital room without looking back, leaving Cassian alone with the quiet certainty that he had, at the very least, finally told her the whole truth, even if it cost him everything he still might have hoped to keep. The mansion looked different in daylight than it had that rainy midnight 2 months ago. Amalia stood in the entrance hall, sunlight pouring through the tall windows, and gave the order she'd been rehearsing in her head since the day she left. "Everyone who worked directly under Bryn's instruction during the transfer attempt," she said to her head of household staff, a steady older woman named Delphine, who'd served the Sterling family since Amalia was little, "is to be released by end of day. Full severance, no exceptions, no negotiations." Delphine nodded without hesitation. "There are 6, Ms. Voss. 2 in the kitchen staff, 1 driver, 3 in administrative roles who helped file the transfer paperwork. All 6, Amalia confirmed. "I want people in this house I can trust completely. Anyone who let Bryn walk through these halls like she owned them doesn't get to stay simply because I've come back." It took most of the day. By evening, the house felt different, lighter somehow, stripped of the quiet betrayals that had been hiding in plain sight for months without her noticing. Amalia walked every room personally, reclaiming each one, from the study where it had all fallen apart to the bedroom where she'd left her wedding ring facing the door. The company took longer, restructuring Sterling Logistics into something fully, unquestionably hers, meant weeks of board meetings, legal filings, and careful negotiations with partners who'd grown nervous during the freeze. She fired 2 board members who'd been quietly courting Bryn's favor during the chaos, replaced them with people who answered only to her, and personally reviewed every shipping contract that had been signed in the last 6 months to make sure nothing else had slipped through, while the syndicate's fingerprints were still smudged across her family's legacy. By the end of the 2nd month, the multi-billion-dollar empire her grandfather built and her father expanded answered to exactly one person, with no ambiguity left in any boardroom about whose signature actually mattered. It should have felt like enough. For a while it did. But some evenings, after the staff had gone home and the house was quiet in a way that used to feel peaceful and now just felt empty, Amalia found herself back in the study, standing at the same window Cassian had stared out of that first terrible night. She kept his journal in the drawer of her desk now, alongside the toxicology reports and Webb's files, evidence she'd need eventually for whatever remained of Bryn's prosecution. Some nights, she took it out and read it again. Tonight was one of those nights. The unconditional divorce papers sat on the corner of her desk, exactly where she'd placed them after leaving the hospital 3 weeks ago, untouched, unsigned, gathering the kind of quiet weight that comes from a decision deferred too many times. She picked up the journal instead and opened it to a page she'd read at least a dozen times already. The entry from the week before everything fell apart. Cassian's handwriting looser than usual, shaken by whatever chemical fog Bryn had been feeding him. I keep thinking about the day I met her father, before the arrangement was even official, and he told me she was the sharpest person in any room she walked into, and that if I was smart, I'd spend the marriage learning from her instead of trying to protect her from things she was already better equipped to handle than I was. I laughed it off then. I understand it now, when it's too late to matter. Amalia's throat tightened. She turned another page, one from even earlier, written months before the drugging had fully taken hold, back when his mind was still entirely his own. Amalia doesn't know I watch her sometimes during board meetings, the way she catches contradictions in contracts before the lawyers do, the way she never once made me feel like the arrangement between our families was a burden instead of a partnership. I didn't expect to fall in love with my own wife. I didn't think that was allowed in a marriage built on paperwork instead of choice. But here I am. She closed the journal slowly and sat with it pressed against her chest for a long time, the way she had that first night at the coastal villa, when the full truth had finally reached her. It didn't erase what he'd done. It didn't erase the silence in that study, or the 3 weeks she'd spent grieving a marriage she thought had been a lie from the start. But it painted a fuller picture than she'd let herself consider in the raw fury of that first night. A man who had been manipulated into believing the worst about her, and who had chosen, even in that manipulated fog, to protect her rather than expose her. Flawed, reckless, nearly catastrophic in its execution, but not malice, never malice. Amalia looked at the unsigned divorce papers on the corner of her desk, and for the first time in 2 months, she felt something other than grief or anger when she thought about her husband. She didn't sign them that night. She simply placed Cassian's journal beside the papers, closed the desk drawer, and turned off the study light, letting both decisions sit unfinished until she was ready to face whatever came next. The invitation came from Cassian himself, delivered not by lawyer or courier, but in a short, careful message to Amalia's private phone. "If you'll have me, I'd like to see the estate one more time, just to say goodbye properly, if that's what you decide. No expectations. I owe you that much." She almost didn't answer. She sat with the message for 2 full days before finally typing back 3 words. "Come on Sunday." He arrived at the estate in the late afternoon, a single suitcase in hand, no driver trailing behind him, no lingering syndicate presence anywhere in sight. Amalia watched him from the conservatory window as his car pulled up the long gravel drive, the same drive she'd walked down in the rain 3 months ago, soaked through and certain her marriage was over. He looked different, thinner, still favoring his healing shoulder slightly, but there was something steadier in the way he carried himself now. None of the restless, calculating energy that used to follow him through every room like a second shadow. Delphine let him in without a word and directed him toward the conservatory, where late sunlight filtered gold through the glass walls onto rows of orchids Amalia's mother had planted decades ago. "You look well," Amalia said when he stepped inside, and meant it, though her voice stayed carefully guarded. I feel like a different person, Cassian admitted. Turns out it's easier to think clearly when you're not being slowly poisoned by someone you trusted. A ghost of dark humor quickly sobered. I disbanded what was left of the syndicate. Officially, legally, every asset liquidated or handed over to federal oversight as part of my cooperation agreement. There's nothing left to run. No territory, no shipping lanes, no empire. I'm not a mafia boss anymore, Amalia, I'm just— He gestured vaguely at himself, almost embarrassed by how unfamiliar the sentence felt in his mouth. A man trying to figure out what an honest life actually looks like. And Bryn? Pleading out. 20 years, minimum. Once the federal charges finish stacking on top of the state ones, she won't be sending anyone else after either of us again. He set his suitcase down by the conservatory door, deliberate, like a man leaving himself no easy exit if this conversation went badly. I brought the divorce papers with me. Figured you might want to finish this properly, in person, instead of leaving it sitting on a desk. Amalia reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the same folded papers he'd offered her at the hospital 3 weeks ago, worn now from being picked up and set down so many times, but still unsigned. I've had these a long time, she said. I kept trying to decide if I actually wanted to sign them, or if I was just angry enough to think I should. And? She looked at him for a long moment. Really looked. The way she had that first devastating night in the study. Except this time, there was no silence staring back at her. No averted eyes. No man too frozen by guilt or manipulation to meet her gaze. Just Cassian, fully present, fully honest, carrying the weight of what he'd done without hiding from any of it. I don't want an arranged marriage anymore, Amalia said. I never really wanted one, if I'm honest. I just learned to love what we built inside the arrangement, because you made it easy to. But I'm done with paperwork deciding what we are to each other. I'm done with contracts and trust deeds and signatures standing in for actual choice. She tore the divorce papers in half, then in half again, and set the pieces down on the small stone table between the orchid rows. I want to choose you, she said, not because a marriage agreement says I have to, and not because guilt says you owe me penance for the rest of your life. I want to build something real, Cassian. Something neither of our families arranged for us. Something that's actually ours. If you want that too. For a moment, Cassian looked like he might not trust himself to speak at all. Then he crossed the small distance between them, careful of his healing shoulder, and pulled her into an embrace that felt nothing like the careful, formal affection of their old arranged life. Something rawer, more grateful, more real. I want that, he said against her hair. I want to earn it, actually earn it this time, instead of just inheriting it because our fathers shook hands over a business deal years ago. Outside the conservatory glass, the sun dropped low over the estate grounds, painting the gravel drive in warm amber light. The same drive where Amalia had once walked away into cold rain, certain she'd lost everything that mattered. She hadn't lost anything in the end. Not the mansion, not the company, not even the man she'd married on paper and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, come to love in earnest. She'd simply had to fight to reclaim all of it on her own terms, and in doing so, had built something far sturdier than any trust deed or arranged contract ever could have promised. Cassian took her hand among the orchids, and for the first time since that terrible midnight 3 months ago, neither of them was thinking about signatures, or empires, or the ghosts of a betrayal that no longer had any power over what came next. They were simply starting over, together, and entirely by choice.